So I'm going to talk about the waterfowl response to the drawdown last spring or last fall on the Emiquon Preserve. And if you don't know who I am, I'm the crazy guy that flies around in the airplane and counts ducks in the Illinois and Mississippi River valleys. I've been doing this for the last 16 years, and it is part of a longer term study of gone on since 1948. And today we're going to talk about the Spoon River, Emiquon Bottoms area here. In the central portion of the Illinois River Valley. So with some things we can do with the data that we collect is measure waterfowl abundance over time, and we've been doing so for the last 72 years, and we can mark that with changes in the river, such as the crash of the river with aquatic bed, loss of aquatic bed in the 1950s, or the addition of the Hennepin and Hopper Lakes restoration, or the addition of the Emiquon restoration in 2007. In 2016, with urging from the Forbes Biological Station and River Biological Station, the Nature Conservancy put in a water control structure so that they could manage water levels, as Doug pointed out earlier, and stole this slide from Doug, basically showing the massive drawdown, 5-foot drawdown of water on Emiquon in the fall of 2020, noting here the peak or the drawdown during the growing season here. Josh Osborn didn't have the data to get the cover map available, so I approximated water levels here, which will show up in a later slide. But blue is a 428, and brown here is a 428.5 MSL level at Emiquon, showing the contours. So this is what the site looked like in September 2nd, and you can see this is about the 428 contour. And then, so all the vegetation that we're going to talk about growing for moist soil plants would be above 428 out here. However, there was a band of mud between 428.5 and 428, basically, and maybe a little bit lower, that developed during the month of September. And so the water was a long way away from the vegetation during most of the fall migration. So that's shown here, the 428 contours in blue. That's where the water was on Flag and Thompson Lakes, and then the 428.5 I'm approximating is where the mud line was. So anything out to the outside of where the brown areas was lush vegetation. There was a band of brown here, and then the water level here in blue. And so what happened with the waterfowl surveys, I got red here being Flag Lake ducks and green being Thompson Lake ducks. And you can see how we had a pretty consistent crash of birds during the month of October. Duck season started here on October 24th. And so pretty rapid decline of birds, and those birds remained relatively sparse out on Emiquon Preserve for most of October and part of November and December. Also here I got ice, helps to explain a little bit of the variation in what's going on in the dotted lines. So Flag Lake ice and Thompson Lake ice, and then moving into spring migration over here. And so trying to explain some of that variation or why the numbers were so low, I go back to a little bit of a study we did on Emiquon in 2012, where we flew line transects over the area and counted ducks at certain areas and related that to hunter intensity during fall. So the public stakes over here, Nature Conservancy tends to hunt up in here, and there's a lease, the Flag Lake lease down here. And so we related hunter intensity to bird abundance on the area. So that study was published in Hydrobiologia publication a couple years ago. And what we basically found was there's an exclusion zone of dabbling ducks around hunted areas, which is approximately 276 meters, or about 60 acres around a hunted spot. And so the Flag Lake hunting areas here in the red circles represent where the blinds were, and those circular distances are those 60-acre plots around those hunted sites. And then occasionally the Flag Lake hunters would hunt opportunistically, and so very little of the Flag Lake area was actually available to waterfowl during fall migration, October, November, and December. And so part of it was hunter disturbance. And then the other part was in late October. This is South Pool of Chautauqua National Refuge, and some of this brown here is some of the best moist soil vegetation you can see anywhere in the country. And we have Emiquon, Thompson Lake, and Flag Lake over here in the background. So in late October, early November, the Fish and Wildlife Service started flooding this vegetation slowly, incrementally putting more water on throughout fall migration. And so this is basically just a breakfast buffet holding all the birds over here, whereas over here, over on Emiquon, the water levels were relatively stagnant during fall migration. And so there's a lot of food up here in North Flag Lake, but no water on it. So that coincides coming up into the end of migration, or coming up to the 1st of November or December, and about Thanksgiving, Nature Conservancy got permission to start adding water to the preserve indicated up here in the line, and that corresponds then with the increase of ducks on the Emiquon on Thompson Lake. Remember, the hunting pressure on Flag Lake limited the number of birds as the water started getting into the vegetation here, and up above this brown line, you can see about the 15th of December, that water actually started getting into the vegetation and making it food. And so those numbers translate here to 15th of December and about the 26th of December. And then if you remember, we froze hard on Christmas Eve. And so on New Year's Eve, the whole area was completely iced in, and that ice remained until approximately the end of February, where we thawed out. And on the March 3rd survey of this spring, you can see that more of the water was into the vegetation, and the birds responded appropriately. And so what that did to the abundance of ducks in the different locations in the Illinois Valley, you can see out of the 25 some odd locations there are, Emiquon normally will rank first or second in most years. However, this year, because of the lack of water in the vegetation, Emiquon dropped down to 7th. And that phenomenal buffet that I mentioned earlier on the South Pool of Chautauqua National Wildlife Refuge, you see approximately 5 million waterfowl use days existed over there this fall. And so, quick summary, pretty self-explanatory. Moist soil vegetation does not necessarily equal ducks. Hunter disturbance is not conducive to duck abundance. However, moist soil vegetation with water equals ducks, especially shallow water with low hunting pressure or refuge conditions. And as always, think about spring migration. A lot of the food resources that are flooded in the fall are used up by spring. And so we need to maintain a little bit of habitat to flood in the spring so that the spring migrants have food as well. And that's all I have. I acknowledge the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Program and Illinois Department of Natural Resources and the Nature Conservancy for funding the projects.